Queensland coroner has ruled that the death of Iranian asylum seeker Hamid Khazaei was preventable and the result of compounding errors in healthcare under Australia's offshore immigration detention system. Hamid Khazaei died in a Brisbane hospital in 2014 after contracting a leg infection in Manus Island Detention Centre. Reporter Alison Horn joins us now from Brisbane. Alison, tell us more about what the coroner said.
Well, Ros, today has been 4 years since Hamid Khazaei died here in Brisbane in 2014. The coroner outlined a number of errors that led to that death. We heard that Hamid Khazaei was being held as a detainee on Manus Island when he presented to the medical clinic there with a leg infection, and that's what we heard was the start of a number of errors. We heard that the clinic did not have the appropriate antibiotics to treat Mr Khazaei, and as a result his condition deteriorated quite quickly. From there, clinicians on the ground requested urgent assistance to transfer Mr Khazaei off the island to receive more specialised critical care. We heard that request was not even refused once but twice, knocked back several times, and by the time Mr Khazaei actually was transferred to Port Moresby, he needed intubating and resuscitating, both of which did not happen. As a result, when he arrived in Brisbane to the Mater Hospital, he was effectively brain dead. He had suffered a number of heart attacks, he had multiple organ failure and had sepsis. So the coroner, Terry Ryan, today saying that Mr Khazaei's death was entirely preventable and was definitely the result of a number of compounding errors within the system.
No antibiotic was available at the Manus Island Regional Processing Centre Clinic to safely and effectively treat the range of infections commonly found in a tropical setting, including the infection suffered by Mr Khazaei. There was no recording system in place at the Manus Island Regional Processing Centre Clinic to comprehensively track and review Mr Khazaei's deteriorating clinical observations.
So Alison, what's been the reaction to the ruling?
Well, Ros, we saw earlier this morning when we arrived here at the Coroner's Court, there were protesters set up outside the court talking about the death of Hamid Khazaei, but also the number of other detention inmates who were being held in offshore processing centres. Now, the coroner didn't specifically talk about the policy in general because it is outside the scope of this inquest, but he did make some sort of commentary that he thought care for detainees would be better placed in somewhere like Australia or New Zealand. The coroner also made a number of recommendations for the Home Affairs Department, most critically going towards that point of patient care within the medical centre on the ground. The coroner was critical that clinicians' advice was overturned and said that the Home Affairs Department should make a policy regarding whether or not and when clinicians' advice should be the first point of advice that is taken into account, specifically that it shouldn't be overridden, and that if clinicians are advising that a patient should be transferred from a detention centre to get treatment elsewhere, then that should happen immediately. The coroner also made recommendations today around detention deaths and whether or not detainees who die in detention should be investigated as death in custody. The only reason that this death, Hamid Khazaei's death, was actually investigated as a death in custody was that when he came into Australia from Port Moresby, he was taken into the care of the Australian government. So legally it had to be investigated as a death in custody, but other inmates who are being held in offshore processing centres, their deaths are not. And so the coroner has recommended to the Home Affairs Department that there should be a policy put in place to make sure that these deaths are independently investigated. Outside court today, though, it was quite mixed reactions. Most people were quite sombre and were also quite upset that it seems that these sort of processes may still be happening in offshore detention processing centres.
The findings showed and confirmed that there are in fact systemic issues. It wasn't one isolated event. but there were a number of problems and a number of problems inherent with trying to provide care that's broadly comparable to Australia in an environment such as Papua New Guinea.
Ros, the federal government this morning has released a statement saying that they extend their condolences to Mr Khazaei's friends and family. They say they are still reviewing the findings from the coroner.
Thanks, Alison.